Once upon a time, scratch that. This is not the story of a brave, broad-shouldered, heroic king galloping off into sunset glory with perfect hair and a chin you could slice cheese on. No. Meet your not-so-fairy tale monarch, a man so physically twisted courtiers thought Satan himself did his sculpting. We're talking spinal curves that would make a roller coaster jealous, a jaw that looked like it lost a bar brawl, and the kind of face that made medieval painters go, eh. Maybe we just do a symbolic crown instead. This king wasn't touched by divinity. They thought he was cursed, bewitched, straight up hexed. And since no one back then knew what genetics were, let alone scoliosis or mandibular prognathism, obviously the only rational explanation was witches. Plotting, royal, revenge. So if you're picturing a crown-wearing Prince Charming with straight posture and fewer than 7 physicians whispering behind his back, go ahead and delete that mental Disney file. This throne came with drama deformities and a family tree best described as vertical incest. Right, so let's talk about royal bobbies. You're picturing a cherub in silk booties being cradled by a nursemaid with impeccable cheekbone structure and a vaguely English accent. Spoiler: reality was less Downton Abbey, more medieval Ripley's Believe It or Not. Meet our poor soul, born into privilege, yes, but also born with what could generously be called architectural irregularities. The moment they unwrapped his royal swaddle, everyone recoiled like they'd just seen a cursed Fabergé egg. His spine, less straight line, more tortured calligraphy. Hunchbacked, twisted, possibly club-footed, like fate decided to experiment and then forgot to hit undo. Back then, deformity wasn't just a medical thing. No. It meant witches, demons, or someone got a little too cozy with the dark arts. Because obviously, if your baby doesn't resemble a Michelangelo sculpture, Satan had to be involved. And so this royal hiccup of a human became a living omen before he said his first word. Ah yes, genetics, nature's brutal inside joke. And when you're a royalty, that joke tends to be inbred. Welcome to the royal family tree, less a tree and more a spindly shrub tangled in its own roots. If your last name ends with of Spain or Habsburg, congratulations, your chin probably casts its own shadow, and your bloodline is playing genetic Russian roulette. Enter King Charles II of Spain, the final boss of Habsburg inbreeding. His family had been treating cousin marriage like a board game for generations, stacking recessives like it was a competition. The result? A man so physically and mentally stunted people thought he was literally cursed. Couldn't talk until he was 4, couldn't walk until he was 8, and his jaw, let's just say soup, was his only viable cuisine. His body was a medical manuscript annotated by every bad hereditary decision from the last 200 years. Bewitched, try genetically betrayed. Let's talk rumors, the medieval kind. You know, whispered in candlelit halls, echoing through drafty castles, and based on nothing more than your unfortunate bone structure. Now imagine walking into a room and your spine introduces you before you do. That was reality for King Charles II of Spain, whose face had the PR power of a scandalous royal affair. Except it wasn't sexy, it was suspicious. People didn't just say he was ugly. No, they said he had to be cursed, hexed, touched by the devil, maybe marinated in sin before birth. Because clearly no one could look like that naturally. His Habsburg jaw could have been its own lineage. His tongue, too thick to speak properly. And his gait, let's just say majestic, isn't the word that comes to mind. But in this superstitious world where witches were blamed for sour milk and stubbed toes, Charles's face wasn't just unfortunate, it was evidence. Welcome to the glittering halls of monarchy, where velvet drapes hide everything from treasonous whispers to tragically crooked spines. The court physicians, those learned men with leeches in one hand and ego in the other, lined up to examine the king's misshapen frame like he was the main course at an anatomy banquet. And oh, they snickered. Maybe not loudly. After all, mocking the king was technically treason. But behind closed goblets and under the guise of clinical detachment, utter comedy gold. Was it rickets? Scoliosis? Satan tap dancing on his vertebrae. Every theory but inbreeding got a mention. Why? Because blamming grandma and grandpa's suspiciously similar family trees was less politically convenient than saying a witch did it. These were supposed to be the brightest minds of the kingdom, but most of them couldn't diagnose a fever without first consulting the stars or an improperly burned goat liver. It wasn't medicine. It was medieval insult comedy with a stethoscope. You'd think royal bones would have the decency to stay in line, literally. But no. In this case, they pirouetted straight into chaos. Our poor monarch didn't just have a little scoliosis. His spine looked like it was trying to spell the word help in cursive. Each vertebra said, "I quit," and the rest of his skeleton enthusiastically followed. Shoulders sloped like collapsing balconies, hips twisted like a Baroque staircase, and the poor man's ribs seemed to fold inward in protest. This wasn't a minor kink in the posture department. It was full structural rebellion, and medieval Europe, ever the master of subtlety, took one look and screamed witchcraft. Because obviously the reasonable explanation for advanced kyphosis is demonic interference, and not, say, congenital bone disease or multi-generational inbreeding. But hey, this is the same era that thought sneezing invited the devil in. So if your back looked like a haunted pretzel, time to blame Satan or grandma's cursed wound. Maybe both. Here's the thing about being called bewitched. In the 17th century, it wasn't some sexy Sabrina the Teenage Witch moment. You didn't get a talking cat and a theme song. You got accusations, exorcisms, and maybe a light medieval torture session if the bishops were feeling spicy. Charles II of Spain, our tragically cursed monarch, had the royal misfortune of looking like every wizard-fearing peasant's worst nightmare. Drooping jaw, check. Couldn't chew properly, check. Couldn't walk till age 8. Double check and maybe burn him just in case. His enemies, and let's be honest, relatives, whispered that he was hexed from the cradle. Spanish nobles literally called him El Hechizado, the bewitched, not in jest but as a political death sentence with a side of scapegoating. Because when centuries of incest collapse into a pile of bones with a crown on top, what better way to explain the disaster than magic rite? It's either that or admit your royal bloodline is basically an elaborate genetic prank. So here we are, the part where the court whisperers can't decide if our poor hunchback king is cursed by Satan, hexed by some jealous crone, or just born with a spine that did its own choreography. Because in the medieval medical manual, written of course by monks who thought sneezing was demonic, there were no chapters titled Advanced Spinal Disorders. Instead, if you walked funny, had one shoulder higher than the other, or God forbid, had asymmetrical cheekbones, congratulations. You were clearly in cahoots with Lucifer, or your mother had angered a witch while pregnant. Either or. You think scoliosis is just a diagnosis today, but back then it was more like a criminal charge. People weren't waiting for MRIs, they were lighting torches, and not metaphorically. The devil had to be involved because how else could a royal bloodline produce this twisty little goblin of a monarch? Sin, sorcery, or just scoliosis? Take your medieval pick. You think Game of Thrones was full of scheming courtiers and bloodthirsty mobs? Try medieval Europe, where scoliosis wasn't just a spinal condition. It was a PR crisis. Picture this: you're a king barely able to stand upright without looking like a sentient coat rack, and suddenly everyone's whispering that you've been hexed. Not just unfortunate genetics, or maybe he needs a chiropractor. No, it had to be witches. Because in a world where science was just alchemy with better handwriting, mysterious ailments had to come from the devil's HR department. So while our hunchbacked majesty is trying to keep a throne from outpacing his tippy vertebrae nobles, our plotting commoners are clutching rosaries, and local witch burners are heating up the pyres. What do you get when you mix chronic pain, deadly superstition, and everyone gunning for your crown? A monarchy with more drama than a Real Housewives reunion, plus the occasional heretic barbecue. Welcome to the royal roast. Being king sounds great, until your spine decides to impersonate a question mark. Forget golden crowns and royal banquets, try ruling a kingdom, while your vertebrae moonwalk in the wrong direction. Our poor monarch wasn't just hunched. He was so visibly contorted that people whispered he was cursed, bewitched, or worse. French. His enemies said his deformities were divine punishment, because of course anything less than runway posture must be Satan's doing. It didn't help that Renaissance medicine was basically medieval fan fiction with leeches. You got a bend in your back. Clearly grandma made a deal with a demon 5 generations ago. Forget chessboards and strategy meetings. He had to combat not only invading armies, but also panic-stricken nobles who thought his scoliosis might jump onto them. It's hard to lead bravely into battle when half your court believes your shadow is possessed, and the other half won't make eye contact. Long live the king. Just maybe not on horseback. So here we are, last stop on the Royal Scoliosis Express. You've got a crown on your head, but your spine's doing interpretive dance. Majesty meets musculoskeletal mayhem, and all those fancy oil paintings, massive lies. They either had to pose this poor lad half-turned like he was waiting for a Renaissance Tinder date, or they just forgot about the hunched part. Oops. But trust behind the ermine and embroidery was a vertebrae situation you could see across a banquet hall. Of course, the whispers never stopped. Some said curse, some said karma, others just snickered from behind goblets. Because medieval politics is nothing if not a high school cafeteria with more knives. And back then, ruling while bent out of alignment was more than a fashion faux pas. It was a perceived cosmic warning. You weren't just a king, you were an omen. Anyway, straighten up, subscribe, and let's keep talking about royals who peaked in physical therapy. Ah yes, the royal prescription pad of the medieval era, feeling bad. Must be demons in your blood. Let's drain that. Our tragically twisted monarch, mangled spine, mangled image, was no exception to the leech-loving lunacy of his time. Got a fever, bleed it. Chronic pain, more bleeding. Deformed at birth. Well, clearly the fault of a malicious star and your mother looking sideways at a frog. Easy fix, bleed until you see God or pass out, either counts as progress. And because this king looked like he'd lost a bar fight with a staircase at birth, the court physicians doubled down. Cupping, leeches, hot pokers, holy water enemas, I wish I were kidding. This wasn't medicine, this was medieval jazz, improvised and painful. But hey, if you didn't die of the blood loss, you were obviously cured, right? Science. Ah yes, fashionably cursed. Because nothing says divinely ordained ruler like a spine doing interpretive dance under your coronation robes. Our tragically contorted king, High Charles II of Spain, we see you, was less monarch, more walking medical mystery. His wardrobe wasn't just royal, it was strategic scaffolding. Layers of velvet and lace weren't style choices. They were camouflage for a chinless jawline, a jaw that kept trying to escape his face, and a spine shaped like a medieval question mark. Royal tailors became part-time engineers, designing drip fit for someone who couldn't even chew properly. Glamour was pain, literally. And yet somehow these brocade-coated deformities just enhanced his mystique. Court whisperers didn't say poor health, they said touched by magic, or demons. And while modern fashion has runways, Charles had corridors where nobles pretended not to notice the king's limp or his drooling. Because in the Habsburg dynasty, cursed wasn't just a vibe, it was basically a dress code. Let them mock cake indeed. Because while France had Marie Antoinette snacking on scandal, Spain had a king so gnarled he could barely chew it. Charles II, yes, the infamous, bewitched Habsburg disaster, wasn't just the butt of royal jokes, he was the royal joke. His birthright came with more chromosomes than common sense and a face that launched 1,000 whispers. Court gossips didn't just mock his appearance, they declared it sorcery. Because clearly when your chin can bench press your entire lineage and your jaws a geographical feature on state maps, it must be the devil's work. Forget cake. Charles was feasting on centuries of inbreeding with a side of exorcism attempts. And the royals, they didn't stop it. They doubled down, kept marrying cousins, and wondered why the dynasty crumbled like a soggy pastry. So go ahead, mock the cake. But history's real tragedy, the royal recipe that baked a boy too broken to rule. And even in death, the poor guy couldn't catch a break. When historians dug up King Richard III in 2012, found under a parking lot because of course they did, they confirmed what whispered gossip and Tudor propaganda had exaggerated for centuries. Yes, his spine was a twisty little roller coaster. Severe scoliosis, real condition. No black magic or vengeful fairies required. But the cherry on the skeletal sundae, the spine still curved. Even 500 years later, the corpse still hunches as if frozen mid-apology for daring to exist in a body that royally offended aesthetic norms. So did he die tragically? Yes. Was he misunderstood? Absolutely. But mostly he's a ghastly reminder that medieval people saw a physical disability and immediately screamed sorcerer, instead of, maybe a chiropractor. Anyway, Richard still twisted, Britain still dramatic, and history still petty. Long live the dead king. See you next time. Bring your own spine. And so we arrive at the baffling, bone-cracking conclusion: deformed, defamed, and because irony never sleeps, deified. Our tragically twisted monarch, once whispered about in corridors as a warped puppet of the devil, now lounges in the cushy halls of legacy like a misunderstood folk hero. Statues, made, myths, written, Netflix series, honestly give it a minute. Centuries of chronic back pain, courtly mockery, and accusations of demonic possession apparently weren't enough to keep the history books from handing him a redemptive arc. It's like if middle school bullies organized your funeral and then made a TikTok tribute to your aura. The moral: if you're powerful, you can be an actual political hunchback with a bad PR team and still come out smelling like sanctified roses a few centuries later. Anyway, like, comment, subscribe, and don't forget to stretch your spine before someone blames it on witchcraft. See you in the next dive into historical misery. So what happens when history leaves you a mess of bones, a twisted spine, and a legacy tangled between pity and propaganda? You get remembered not for how you ruled, but for how you bent. That's the post-mortem slap in the face dealt to figures like King Richard III. Yes, the one Shakespeare turned into a walking cautionary tale about ambition and scoliosis. Was he evil because he had a hunchback? Or did future historians toss his reputation down a flight of stairs just because he couldn't walk up one? The legacy dilemma isn't just about bad posture meeting worse PR. It's about how a physical deformity becomes shorthand for moral corruption, how a twisted spine gets twisted into metaphor. Reminder: bones don't lie, but people sure as hell do. So next time the history books show you a villain with a limp, maybe ask who handed them the pen. See you in bones. Imagine walking into a diplomatic summit, and before you've said a single word, the room has already made up its mind. because your spine entered the conversation before you did. That's what happened when foreign envoys first laid eyes on King Charles II of Spain. Instead of royal dignity they got, well, a human question mark draped in brocade. Not exactly long live the king vibes. And with his infamous Habsburg jaw jutting out like a misplaced shelf and a posture better suited to a horror film poster, locals whispered of curses. Foreigners. They opted for the polite lie. How unique. You could master 10 languages, charm snakes, and control an empire, but none of that mattered when you looked like you lost a joust with birth itself. Words may be diplomatic, but bones, oh, they scream in every language. And Charles II's bones, they sang a tragic opera in slow motion. When you're emperor of one of the most powerful realms in Europe and still get referred to as the Bewitched, you're not exactly winning hearts and minds, no matter how regal your creased parchment of a family tree might be. Papal envoys didn't just struggle with his Spanish, they struggled with not wincing. They came bearing gifts and left with curses on their minds and pity in their eyes. This was more than scoliosis. This was a living, wheezing cautionary tale about the dangers of family reunions turning into breeding programs. His gait said, "Final boss fight," but his fragile frame whispered prologue. Every tilt of the spine, every droop of the lip became a diplomatic Rorschach test. Is he sick? Is he cursed? Is he dying? So when Charles hobbled his way into a throne room, you didn't get the thunderclap of regal command, you got a slow, uncomfortable shuffle, and a pause long enough for everyone to glance awkwardly at the floor. That wasn't just a man walking in. That was an international conversation in posture alone. Ambassadors didn't need translators. They needed chiropractors and priests. And bear in mind, this wasn't an era when you could slap on a posture corrector and hope for the best. The 17th century's solution to spinal curvature was usually humor it, bleed it, or blame a witch. Meanwhile, Charles tried to do the job of a king while looking like he belonged folded in a carry-on. Imagine running a global empire when your own body is allergic to being upright. He was the personification of hereditary decline, a pile of Habsburg chromosomes having a panic attack in public. His every appearance was an accidental spectacle, not by design, just by default. So forget Beau's curtsies and courtly intrigue. The real diplomacy at any royal greeting began the second Charles II walked in, and gravity followed. So here we are, you can't spell diplomacy without pity, because frankly nobody was sending ambassadors to Charles II of Spain out of respect. They were sending them out of sheer medical curiosity, and let's be honest, pity. Imagine being so visibly cursed by centuries of inbreeding that foreign dignitaries show up just to confirm, yep, the rumors are true. His jaw is doing that thing, and his speech does sound like gargling marbles. Monarchs across Europe tiptoed diplomatically not because they feared his wrath, but because they feared his genes. Courting Spain was less like chess and more like a hospital visit, awkward hushed tones, and everyone praying the patient didn't accidentally declare war while drooling on the floor. But hey, if you can't build an empire, at least you can guilt-trip the planet with your malformed Habsburg face. That was Charles, the diplomatic equivalent of a mercy casserole. And oh, the casserole kept coming. Charles wasn't just the King of Spain. He was the royal equivalent of a get better soon card signed by half of continental Europe. Every Duchess, Baron, and bastard prince had a niece to offer or a treaty to whisper, not because they expected him to rule effectively, but because everybody wanted dibs on the inheritance bonanza once his fragile little candle flickered out. Charles was the last Habsburg Spain had he was the end of the line, quite literally. His family tree didn't branch, it looped tragically, but you couldn't be too obvious about it. No one wanted to spook the Spanish court into revolt, or worse, into thinking that Charles was capable of making decisions. So everyone smiled, bowed, and nodded politely while navigating the minefield that was his health. And I say health, with the kind of quotation marks that should come with their own health warnings. The king couldn't chew, he couldn't walk properly, he couldn't produce an heir. And at one point he was reportedly exhuming corpses to ask them for advice. That's where we were. Political strategy was just short of a seance. And yet, despite the dead-in-the-eyes stares people gave each other over Spanish wine, no one backed off. Austria, France, England. They all wanted access because Spain was still sitting on a glittering empire, even if the guy in charge had trouble licking a spoon. So what do you do when your king is a genetic cautionary tale, and your empire is a piñata ready to burst? You orchestrate the world's slowest funeral, one laced with royal weddings, secret treaties, fake consultations, and diplomatic letters that read more like condolence notes. Even the Pope, yes, Pope, got involved not just for the usual religious meddling, but because divine intervention felt like the only medical plan left. Charles was exorcised more than once. Let me say that again, they called in professional demon chasers because doctors had given up and science hadn't entered the building yet. What else can diplomacy be if not pity when one of your key state strategies is, maybe the devil cursed him? In the final years of his reign, Charles II wasn't issuing mandates. He was casting shadows. Courtiers avoided eye contact, nobles staged power plays under his nose, and the international community behaved like guests at a dinner party hosted by someone actively on fire. Everyone kept smiling. No one brought it up. The air reeked of slow-brewing catastrophe dressed in lace. So remember that the next time someone waxes poetic about kings and courtly love. Charles II didn't inspire sonnets. He inspired succession wars. Empires rotated around him, not because of strength or charisma, but because everyone was waiting for the human time bomb in a velvet hat to finally go kaboom. And boy, when he did, the world scrambled for his skeleton throne faster than pigeons on a dropped churro. But that's next time. Go hydrate, light a candle for the gene pool, and we'll see you in the next descent into royal dysfunction. You'd think a king would get to choose how he dies, heroically in battle or at least dramatically over a goblet of poisoned wine. But no, not Charles II of Spain. This poor royal was custom-built by centuries of incest and Catholic guilt, and when the end finally came, it wasn't betrayal or war that killed him. It was his own collapsing body. His autopsy read like a medieval horror scroll, just one shriveled testicle missing pieces of skull, and so much internal decay that priests declared his death divine punishment. That's right, God's hit list apparently had a Habsburg on it. Because when you're born with a jaw that can't chew and organs arranged like a Picasso painting, people don't call a doctor. They call an exorcist. And instead of a medical diagnosis, you get a spiritual smitting. Death by divine design. More like medieval healthcare's final middle finger. And Charles didn't go quietly either. His final years were less noble poignancy and more haunted doll left in a crypt. The court grew so convinced he was cursed that they rounded up suspected witches for questioning, because clearly the most logical explanation for a withered testicle and chronic diarrhea was demonic interference. One poor nun was accused of casting spells via cake. Cake, as in dessert sorcery. Bon appetit, Satan. Meanwhile, royal physicians, those paragons of outdated science and homebrew sadism, tried to fix him the best way they knew how, with more bleeding purging and a generous helping of mercury. Yes, mercury, because nothing says healing like pouring toxic metal down the throat of a man whose body was already held together by sheer legacy and papal denial. And when that didn't work, they resorted to burning incense near his bed and calling in mystic monks. You can't make this up. By the end, Charles was vomiting nightly hallucinating saints and unable to digest food. His weight dropped so drastically that his corpse was reportedly missing a stomach entirely, or at least one anyone could identify. His hair fell out. His teeth turned black. And through it all, he ruled in name, only propped up like a marionette by nobles desperately trying to make it seem like Spain wasn't rotting from the crown down. Spoiler, it was. And when he finally did wheeze his last, the autopsy wasn't just grotesque, it was biblical. His heart was black as coal. Half his brain seemed MIA. His intestines were described simply as putrefied. The Spanish clergy took one look, panicked, and decided this wasn't poor genetics or catastrophic inbreeding. No, this was sin, finally collecting its royal tab. Which meant Charles didn't just die a man. He died a moral. His body became a sermon. A silent, stinking billboard for why sleeping with your cousin, ignoring basic hygiene, and letting monks handle your healthcare might not be long-term strategies. His legacy: a power vacuum, a European war, and a new ruler who, gasp, actually closed his jaw. So yes, death by divine design. Or perhaps just the universe finally slapping the House of Habsburg with a long overdue cease and desist. Either way, it wasn't glorious. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even particularly dignified. But if you're considering a career in royal bloodlines or 17th century medicine, maybe don't. Alright, that's enough corpse talk for today. Go hydrate, hug your pancreas, and we'll see you next time for more historical horrors dressed in silk and powdered wigs.